The wind rolled across the open land, carrying with it the dry scent of dust, sage, and distant rain. Somewhere beyond the red hills, a hawk screamed, circling over the canyon like a ghost of the wild. The woman tightened her shawl around her shoulders, her heart beat louder than the restless wind. She had ridden farther than she ever thought she would, away from her home, away from the man she was promised to, and now, away from the one she could no longer forget. Behind her, the Apache camp was a faint memory, a shimmer of smoke in the distance, but she could still feel his eyes on her, dark and calm like a river before the storm. He had warned her once in that deep, low voice that unsettled even her breathing. "Do it again," he said, after she tried to turn from him before. "And I'll never let you go." She thought he was speaking out of pride, the kind men carried like a weapon, but there was something in his tone, something she didn't understand until now, that made her shiver even under the burning sun. It wasn't anger that lived in that warning. It was something fiercer, heavier. It was a promise. The land stretched endlessly before her, brown mesas fading into pale blue sky. The trail was rough and lonely, the kind that punished travelers who lost their way. Her horse snorted, tired from the miles they'd covered since dawn, and she leaned forward to whisper soft encouragement. Every hoofbeat felt like a question she couldn't answer. Why was she leaving? Why now when her heart had begun to betray her? She had known the Apache Chief for only a few weeks, though each day felt carved in memory deeper than a lifetime. He wasn't what the settlers said. He wasn't the savage they whispered about over church suppers or warned their daughters to fear. He was proud, yes, and dangerous in ways words couldn't describe. But he carried himself with a quiet dignity, a strength that came from surviving what others never could. The first time she met him was by accident. Her wagon had broken near the canyon rim, and her brother had gone for help. The sun was falling when she saw him appear from the ridge, silent as a shadow, his horse tall and black against the sky. She remembered the way his hand rested easily on the reins, how his eyes met hers without hurry or judgment. He didn't smile then. He only studied her, as though measuring the weight of her fear. She had tried to speak, but her voice failed. Then he said, in slow, careful English, "You are far from home." It wasn't a question. It was a truth, and it struck her harder than the dry wind against her face. Over the next days she learned that the land she thought she knew belonged to him and his people long before fences or flags claimed it. He guided her back to safety, keeping distance but never too far. He spoke little, yet every word seemed chosen, heavy with meaning. She noticed how even in silence he commanded respect, not from force, but from the quiet certainty of someone who knew who he was and what he stood for. When she returned home, something inside her refused to rest. She would catch herself thinking of him while tending the fire or gathering water from the well. At night, when coyotes howled across the plains, she would remember his face lit by the fading light, and her heart would stir with an ache she couldn't name. She told herself it was foolishness, a woman's weakness for mystery. But when he appeared again weeks later, she realized it was fate testing her courage. That evening, the sky burned crimson above the canyon. He came with 2 of his men, riding, slow, carrying trade goods, pelts, beads, and dried herbs. Her father greeted them with caution, her brother with suspicion. Yet when her eyes met his, the noise of the yard faded away. The Apache Chief dismounted and offered her a glance that lingered a heartbeat too long. She felt it like a touch, one that left her unable to breathe. Days later, she found herself walking toward the ridge where they had first met. He was there again, waiting as if he knew she would come. The wind lifted her hair and carried the scent of cedar between them. He told her stories, of rivers that ran before settlers came, of battles fought not for glory but for survival. His words drew her in piece by piece, until she realized she had crossed a line she could never uncross. The world beyond the ridge no longer felt like her own. Her father's house, the church bells, the faces that once brought her comfort, all seemed pale compared to the pull of the wild that lived in his eyes. She began to understand that love, when it came, didn't always fit into the shape people wanted. It could be raw, forbidden, and impossible to forget. But the moment she tried to pull away, fear and sense fighting against what her heart desired, his voice stopped her cold. "Do it again," he said quietly, stepping closer until the air between them trembled. "And I'll never let you go." That night, she couldn't sleep. His words burned through her thoughts like fire through dry grass. She rode home under the moonlight, but nothing felt safe anymore. The world had changed, and she was no longer the woman who could ignore what she felt. Now, as she rode through the canyon once more, her decision felt heavier than the sky. She wanted to escape him, to prove she still belonged to her own kind. But every sound, every shadow reminded her of him. A lone wolf howled from the ridge, and her horse shifted nervously. She looked back, heart pounding, half expecting to see his tall figure emerging from the dusk. The sun was dipping low, painting the rocks in blood-red light. Somewhere behind her, a rider followed, slow and steady. She could hear the faint rhythm of hooves matching her own. Panic seized her chest. She urged her horse forward, but the sound grew nearer, too steady, too sure. He was coming. She knew she should keep riding, should not look back. But when she reached the bend where the trail split, she stopped. The wind carried his scent before she saw him. Then through the rising dust he appeared, mounted on that black horse, his hair catching the last light of the sun. Neither spoke for a long while. The silence between them was louder than words. He dismounted slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. There was no anger in them, only a deep, unspoken certainty. She swallowed hard, her throat dry. "You shouldn't have followed me," she managed to whisper. He stepped closer, his voice low and calm. "You knew I would." Her heart thudded painfully. "You don't own me," she said, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her. He studied her, the wind tugging at the fringe of his clothes. "Then why do you keep running?" The question cut through her defenses like a blade. She wanted to answer, to say that it was wrong, that the world would never understand, that she couldn't belong to him or his people. But before the words could form, he took another step forward. For a moment, the world stilled. The wind, the light, even her breath. His gaze held hers, fierce yet tender, as though daring her to turn away again. And when she did, when she finally turned her horse to ride toward the valley, his voice came after her, deep and quiet, carrying through the dusk like thunder rolling over the plains. "Do it again," he warned, "and I'll never let you go." The words followed her long after the sun vanished, sinking into her bones. She didn't know if they were a threat, a promise, or something far more dangerous. All she knew was that the moment she turned from him, her heart no longer felt like her own. Somewhere in the canyon behind her, the Apache Chief watched her silhouette fade into the darkening horizon, his expression unreadable. The wind howled between the cliffs, carrying the sound of her retreating hoofbeats, and the beginning of something neither of them could undo. The night fell heavy over the desert, the kind of darkness that swallowed every sound except the whisper of the wind and the slow rhythm of a restless heart. She camped near a cluster of rocks, her small fire throwing gold light against the canyon walls. Her horse grazed quietly a few paces away, but every time a branch snapped or a coyote cried in the distance, she felt that same prickle of unease crawl up her spine. It wasn't fear of the wild that haunted her. It was the thought that he was still out there, watching from the shadows. She told herself she didn't care. She had made her choice when she rode away from his camp, from that look in his eyes that made her forget the world she came from. She had a life waiting beyond the desert, or at least she tried to believe she did. Her father's ranch, the small town with its gossiping mouths and judging eyes, the life she'd once thought would be enough. Yet now it all seemed so far away, so empty. The flame crackled softly, and she found herself staring into it, lost in memory. She thought of the first time she saw him without the paint and feathers that had made him seem untouchable. It was near the river, early morning, mist still rising off the water. He was washing blood from his arm, a wound from a hunting accident. She had followed the sound unknowingly, meaning only to fill her canteen. When he looked up, she froze. There was no threat in his expression, only quiet surprise. The chief stood tall, the water gliding down his skin, his long dark hair hanging over his shoulders. In that moment, he looked less like a warrior and more like a man carrying too many ghosts. He didn't reach for his weapon or call his men. He just said her name, slowly, as though testing its weight. Hearing her name on his tongue changed something inside her. She remembered how his eyes softened then, how the silence between them seemed to hold everything they couldn't say. It wasn't meant to happen, that quiet understanding between two worlds that weren't supposed to meet. But it did, and it grew like wild roots under the soil, silent, stubborn, impossible to tear out. Her father had warned her about the Apache long before that. He told her they were proud, fierce, and never forgave betrayal. They live by their own laws, he'd said. Cross them once and you'll never sleep easy again. She had believed him then, but when she met the chief, she saw no cruelty in him, only a kind of weary strength. He spoke of peace, but also of the line that settlers kept crossing, the land they took, the rivers they fenced. He didn't plead or justify. He simply told the truth of his people. That truth lingered with her more than she wanted to admit. The crackle of the fire broke her thoughts. She rose and threw another branch into the flames, watching the sparks fly into the night sky. The wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of hoofbeats again. She froze, her hand instinctively reaching for the small revolver tucked inside her saddlebag. But when the sound faded, she realized how foolish she must look, jumping at ghosts. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. Back in his camp, the Apache Chief stood on the edge of the cliff, the moonlight casting his face in silver. He watched the trail below, his jaw set, his eyes burning with something that wasn't anger but hurt. He had let her go once, believing she would return. She hadn't. Now she was out there alone, and the land was no place for a woman without protection. Yet he knew that wasn't what drove him to follow her. It was the bond he hadn't meant to form, the one she tried to break but never could. He remembered the night before she left. The campfire had burned low, painting her face in warm shadows. She had sat near the edge of the circle, her hands fidgeting with the edge of her shawl, her gaze distant. He knew something was wrong. When he asked, she said she had to go home. He told her home could be wherever she chose it to be. She shook her head, saying she didn't belong among his people. The words had stung deeper than a blade. He had turned away then, fighting the impulse to stop her. But when she stood to leave, he caught her wrist, holding it firm enough that she looked back. That was when he said the words that now echoed in her mind. "Do it again, and I'll never let you go." He didn't say it out of rage. He said it because he knew she was running from something more than just him. She was running from the truth that bound them. By morning, she was gone. The firelight flickered low. She wrapped herself in a blanket and tried to rest, though the night refused to let her. When she finally drifted into uneasy sleep, she dreamed of his eyes. Dark, steady, filled with something that pulled her in no matter how far she tried to flee. When dawn came, the horizon burned orange, and she packed her things quickly, eager to reach the next settlement before nightfall. The trail wound through narrow canyons and dry riverbeds, places where sound echoed and the past seemed to linger. She noticed a hawk circling above her, and for some reason it reminded her of him, always watching, always near. She hated that her heart quickened at the thought. By midday, she reached a small stream and stopped to rest. As she knelt to drink, she caught sight of something. A single hoofprint pressed fresh into the mud. Her stomach tightened. It wasn't hers. She turned sharply, scanning the ridges. The land was still, silent except for the rustle of the breeze through dry grass. But she knew. He was following her. Part of her wanted to be angry. Another part, one she refused to name, felt something else. She mounted her horse again, riding faster now, trying to outpace her own thoughts. Yet no matter how far she went, the image of his face haunted her. The way his voice carried through the wind. The warmth in his eyes when he spoke of things that mattered. The road ahead led toward the trading post, a lonely place run by an older couple who sold goods to both settlers and the tribes. She had been there before once with her father, and she hoped they might offer shelter for a night. When she arrived, the smell of tobacco and wood smoke filled the air. The man behind the counter looked up, startled to see her alone. "You came through the canyon by yourself?" he asked, disbelief mixing with concern. She nodded. "Just passing through," he frowned. "Best you don't linger long. There's been movement in the hills. Scouts say the Apaches are restless again." The words made her chest tighten. She forced a calm smile. "I'll be gone by morning." He studied her a moment longer, then nodded, motioning toward a small room in the back. "You can rest there if you've got the coin." That night she sat by the window watching the darkness outside. The trader's words echoed in her mind. The Apaches are restless again. Was he among them? Was he angry now, thinking she had betrayed him? Or was he simply keeping his word, following until she made her choice clear? She didn't know anymore which fate frightened her more, that he would find her or that he wouldn't. As the wind picked up, she caught movement near the edge of the woods. A figure on horseback paused in the moonlight, watching the trading post from a distance. Her heart jumped. The rider didn't move for a long while, then turned slowly and vanished into the trees. She pressed her hand against the window pane, torn between fear and something that felt dangerously close to longing. She whispered into the quiet, though no one could hear. "Why can't you let me go?" Far beyond the clearing, the Apache chief reined in his horse. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes never left the faint light flickering from the window where she stood. He had followed her trail across 2 days and nights, through storm and silence. Every time he thought to turn back, something inside refused. He wasn't sure if he wanted to bring her home, or simply remind her where her heart already belonged. His people had warned him that the settlers would bring nothing but sorrow. They said his connection with her would break the balance, stir trouble with both worlds. Perhaps they were right, but he had seen truth in her eyes, the kind of truth that could not be buried by fear or tradition. The wind stirred his hair as he looked toward the trading post one last time. He could leave now, and no one would ever know. But when he remembered her trembling voice and the way she turned from him, his decision hardened. He nudged his horse forward, disappearing into the shadows. The night closed behind him, but his words, his warning, seemed to live in the wind itself. She sat awake until dawn, unable to rest. Somewhere out there, she knew he was near, waiting for the moment she'd face what she had been running from. And deep down, though she wouldn't yet admit it, she knew she no longer wanted to escape. The fear she felt was no longer of him. It was of herself, and of how far she was willing to fall for a man the world told her she could never love. The first light of morning touched the trading post, painting the world in pale gold. She had barely slept, her thoughts circling like restless horses. The woman who had once believed she could ride away from anything now sat by the window, her eyes searching the horizon for a man she swore she didn't want to see again. The land stretched wide and quiet, but she could feel his presence somewhere beyond the trees. The Apache Chief was near. She knew it as surely as she knew her own name. The old trader's wife noticed her unease while pouring coffee into a tin cup. "You look like someone waiting for trouble," she said kindly. "Out here, that's usually what finds you first." She forced a small smile. "I'm not waiting for anyone." The woman raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. "Well, if you are, make sure he's worth the dust you're stirring." The words lingered long after. Worth the dust. She thought of his face again. The calm strength, the quiet fury, the way he looked at her not as a fragile thing, but as someone capable of standing beside him. Few men had ever looked at her like that. Yet it was that same look that terrified her, because it meant she could lose herself in him completely. By midday, a few riders came to the post, settlers from the next town. They carried rifles, their horses streaked with sweat. The men spoke in low tones with the trader, and she caught pieces of their talk. There had been a raid near the river, they said. Wagons burned, 2 men missing. The words hit her like a cold wind. She knew the settlers would blame the Apache, whether it was true or not. Fear spread through the small outpost. The trader began locking up supplies, his wife whispering prayers. One of the riders glanced toward her, his tone sharp. "You came from the South Trail, didn't you? You see anything?" She shook her head quickly. "Nothing. Just open land." He narrowed his eyes. "That country's crawling with them. You shouldn't be out there alone. Not unless you've got a reason." She turned away, pretending not to hear, but her hands trembled. The settlers' anger was dangerous, born from fear and ignorance. If they found out she had any connection to the Apache Chief, she knew what they'd say. She'd be branded a traitor, or worse. That evening, while the sky bled into sunset, she slipped out the back of the post and walked to the edge of the woods. The air was heavy, the silence uneasy. She looked around, half hoping, half dreading that he might appear. And then he did, emerging from the trees like a shadow made of earth and wind. Her heart leapt. He was close enough now that she could see the wear on his face, the tiredness around his eyes. He looked as though he hadn't slept either. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. "They're saying there was a raid." He studied her quietly. "It wasn't us." "I know," she said softly, glancing back toward the post. "But they don't." He stepped closer, his voice low. "You're afraid of them, but not of me." Her breath caught. "Maybe I should be. A faint smile touched his lips, but it didn't reach his eyes. You left my camp. You ran from what you felt. But the land doesn't lie, and neither do you. She shook her head. It's not that simple. You and I come from different worlds. They'd never let this... She stopped, unable to finish the thought. He looked past her toward the horizon. The white men draw lines through the land and call it theirs. They don't ask who was here before. I don't care for their rules. His gaze returned to her. Do you? The question struck deep. All her life she had done what was expected. Obedient daughter, dutiful woman, quiet observer of men's choices. Yet standing before him she felt stripped of all that. The wild around them seemed to demand truth, not manners. Before she could answer, a gunshot cracked through the air. Birds scattered from the trees. She gasped, dropping low as another shot followed. He grabbed her arm and pulled her behind a boulder. Voices echoed from the distance, the settlers from the post. They saw you, she whispered, her pulse racing. He glanced toward the ridge, his hand tightening on his weapon. Then they'll see what happens when they aim at what's mine. Don't, she pleaded. If you fight them, it'll start something you can't stop. He didn't respond right away. The fury in his eyes was tempered by something else, restraint perhaps, or the faint hope that she could still calm him. After a moment, he lowered his rifle slightly. The shouts grew closer, and she knew they didn't have long. She turned to him, desperate. Go, please. They'll kill you if they find you here. He studied her face, then nodded once. If I go, will you stay safe? She swallowed hard. I'll try, his jaw tightened. Trying won't be enough. Then, as quietly as he had appeared, he vanished into the shadows of the trees. The riders burst through moments later, their guns drawn, scanning the area. She pretended to be startled, pretending she had been gathering water from the stream. One of the men stopped his horse near her. You hear shots? He demanded. She forced her voice steady. I thought it was hunters. He narrowed his eyes, scanning the trees. Could have been them savages watching us. Best not to wander off alone, miss. She nodded quickly, but her eyes betrayed her. She prayed they wouldn't notice how shaken she truly was. After they rode off, she waited until the sun dipped below the horizon before returning to the post. Her hand still trembled when she opened the door. The trader's wife looked up in worry. You all right, dear? Yes, she said quietly. Just startled. That night she couldn't eat. The air inside the small post felt too tight, too filled with whispers and suspicion. She knew it was only a matter of time before the settlers decided to hunt for the Apache who had been spotted near the ridge. And if they found him, they wouldn't stop to ask questions. Out in the wilderness, the Apache Chief rode hard through the canyons. His mind burned with anger, not just at the settlers but at her, for putting herself in danger, for making him care enough to follow. He had fought battles before, but none like this. This was not a fight against men or weapons. It was a fight against fate. At his camp, his second-in-command watched him pace. You follow her again and the others will speak, the man warned. They'll say she's turned your heart soft. The chief's gaze hardened. A man who feels nothing is already dead. The other man looked uneasy. The white men are gathering. If they come, they won't stop at her. They'll burn our ground again. He nodded, knowing the truth of it. The choice was cruel, save his people, or protect the woman who had unknowingly tied herself to his heart. The next morning, the settlers formed a search party. She watched them mount their horses, rifles glinting in the sun. Her chest ached with dread. She wanted to warn him but couldn't without revealing everything. As they rode off, the trader approached her. You look like you got something to say, he muttered. She hesitated, then shook her head. No, I just pray they don't find what they're looking for. He studied her, suspicion flickering in his eyes. You've seen someone out there, haven't you? Her silence said enough. He sighed. Girl, the world's cruel to folks who mix their hearts across battle lines. That night, a storm rolled across the plains. Wind howled through the cracks in the wood, rain slashing against the windows. She stood outside, her shawl soaked through, staring into the darkness. Lightning split the sky, and for a moment she saw him again, on horseback, on the ridge, watching her. He hadn't left. Her breath caught, her heart torn between fear and something deeper. The thunder roared, drowning every thought but one. He had come back for her, even when it meant risking everything. But somewhere beyond the storm, gunfire cracked again. The settlers had found the trail, and she knew with a sinking heart that the real fight was only beginning. She turned toward the sound, torn between running to warn him and staying hidden. The wind whipped through her hair as she whispered a prayer. One for him, and one for the part of herself she feared she'd already lost to him. And far out in the dark hills, the Apache Chief reined his horse toward the gunfire, his eyes burning with resolve. He would not let the white men take her. Not again. The land held its breath as two worlds moved closer to collision, each driven by love, pride, and the kind of fate that refused to be silenced. The rain poured harder as the night deepened, the wind screaming across the open land like a spirit set free. She stood outside the trading post, her shawl clinging to her shoulders, her eyes fixed on the dark ridge where lightning kept revealing flashes of movement. The gunfire had stopped for a while, but she knew it wasn't over. The silence between the bursts was always worse. The waiting, the not knowing who still breathed on the other side of the storm. Her heart pounded as she thought of him out there, facing men who would never understand him. She had prayed he would turn back, that he would ride away and let the anger of the settlers pass. But deep down, she knew the Apache Chief was not the kind of man to run. He would meet whatever came with the same calm defiance she had seen in his eyes the first time they met. And now, because of her, he was in the middle of a fight he didn't start. Inside the post, the trader and his wife whispered in fear. They had barred the doors and doused the lamps, leaving only the faint glow of the fire. The smell of damp earth and smoke filled the air. The woman's trembling hand gripped her arm. "Stay away from the windows, child. There's killing out there tonight," but she couldn't move away. Each thunderclap made her flinch, and every flash of light pulled her back to the window. She could almost see him in her mind, riding through the rain, his horse slick with mud, his eyes fixed on the ridge where the settlers hunted. She felt a tear mix with the rain on her face. She had wanted to leave him to keep him safe, but she had only led danger to his trail. Out beyond the hills, the Apache Chief crouched behind a cluster of rocks, water running down his face. His horse stood tethered nearby, restless and snorting at the sound of distant shouts. He could see the glow of lanterns moving through the storm. The settlers had split into groups, searching every hollow of the land. He knew they wouldn't stop until they found him. Beside him knelt his second-in-command, a younger warrior with a fresh scar across his cheek. "There are too many," the man whispered. "We should move north." The chief's voice was steady. "They have come for blood. If we leave, they will take it from someone else." The younger man hesitated. "The woman. She is near. They will think she led you here." The chief's jaw tightened. He didn't answer, but his eyes darkened with resolve. He had made peace once for her sake. He would not let her pay the price of his choices. Back at the post, she heard hooves pounding closer. The trader ran to the window, clutching his rifle. "They're coming," he muttered. "Riders from town." The door burst open and a half-dozen men stormed in, dripping rain and fury. Their leader, a tall man with a scar under his eye, shoved his way to the counter. "We tracked one of them Apaches to this ridge," he barked. "We'll rest here before we move out again." The trader nodded nervously, motioning toward the fire. "You're welcome to warm yourselves." The woman stayed still, heart hammering. She felt their eyes turn to her, rough and curious. The scarred man frowned. "You came through the South Trail yesterday, didn't you?" She nodded slowly. He took a step closer. "You see any of them? Any signs?" Her throat tightened. "No, nothing but storm clouds." He studied her face. "You sure about that?" "Some say he's been following you." The Apache Chief. The room went cold. She could feel everyone's gaze fixed on her. Her hands trembled and she forced them still. "That's not true," she said quietly. "You're chasing ghosts." The man's eyes narrowed. "We'll find out soon enough." He turned to his men. "Rest up, then we move at dawn. If the chief's near, we'll smoke him out before sunrise." She slipped away to the back of the post, her mind spinning. Dawn. They were going to hunt him down. And if she didn't do something, he wouldn't stand a chance. She couldn't let him die for something she caused. The trader's wife caught her arm. "Don't be foolish, girl. You can't go out there." "I have to," she whispered. "He's out there because of me." The older woman looked at her, torn between pity and fear. "If those men catch you helping him, they'll hang you beside him." "I'd rather die telling the truth than live with the lie," she said, her voice trembling but steady. She waited until the men had settled, their laughter dull under the sound of rain. Then she slipped out the back door, leading her horse quietly into the darkness. The mud pulled at her boots, and every sound seemed too loud, too dangerous. She guided the horse up the narrow trail that wound toward the ridge. Lightning cracked again, revealing the canyon below. The world seemed caught between fire and shadow. She called his name softly, the wind stealing her voice. Then from the darkness a figure emerged. He stepped from behind the rocks, his hair soaked, his eyes fierce and searching. "You shouldn't have come," he said, his tone roughened by exhaustion. "They're coming for you," she said quickly. "At dawn, you have to leave." He shook his head. "If I leave, they'll follow me to my people. Then I'll go with you," she blurted, her heart pounding. "I'll tell them it was me who brought them here." His expression hardened. "No, they would not listen. You think your words can stop their hate? I don't care what they believe. I just want you to live." For a long moment, neither spoke. The rain softened, the storm easing into a heavy drizzle. The sound of water dripping from the rocks filled the silence between them. He looked at her then, really looked, as though trying to memorize the lines of her face in the dim light. "You would give up your life for mine?" he asked quietly. She swallowed hard. "I think I already did the moment I turned away." The emotion that flickered in his eyes was almost too much to bear. But before either could speak again, the distant sound of hoofbeats echoed through the valley. He turned sharply toward the sound. "They're close." She grabbed his arm. "Come with me. There's an old mine near the ridge. You can hide there until the storm clears." He hesitated only a second before nodding. She led him up the narrow path, her heart hammering. The ground was slick with mud, and the wind carried faint shouts from below. Lanterns bobbed through the darkness, growing brighter with every second. By the time they reached the mine entrance, her hands were shaking. The wooden beams creaked under the weight of years, and the air smelled of dust and damp stone. He looked around, then turned to her. "You shouldn't stay." "I'm not leaving," she said. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the drops of rain clinging to his lashes. "You'll be hunted too." "Then let them hunt," she said, her voice breaking. "I won't run anymore." For a heartbeat, it seemed the world stopped. Then a sharp shout echoed through the canyon, followed by the crack of a rifle. The bullet struck the rocks nearby, sending shards of stone flying. She gasped, and he pulled her close, shielding her from the next shot. "They've found us," he said. She could hear the men shouting, their voices growing nearer. Panic surged in her chest. "We can't stay here. They'll trap us inside." He looked toward the back tunnel of the mine, where darkness swallowed the path. "There's another way out, but it's narrow, dangerous. Then lead the way." They moved quickly through the passage, the flicker of lightning barely reaching them. The air grew colder, the tunnel twisting deeper underground. Behind them, the sound of boots and angry voices grew louder. At one point she stumbled, and he caught her arm, steadying her. Their eyes met for a brief, breathless second. Neither spoke, but something passed between them, something final and unspoken. When they reached the far opening, he paused, scanning the slope below. The rain had turned the ground to slick clay. In the distance they could see the flicker of torches closing in. He turned to her. "If they catch you, tell them you were lost. Tell them I forced you." She shook her head fiercely. "I won't lie. Not this time." He almost smiled then, that small, quiet curve of his lips that made her forget the danger around them. "Then it seems neither of us will turn back." Thunder rolled across the sky again, and the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon. The ridge below glowed faintly, showing the line of riders spreading out across the valley. They were trapped between two worlds, hers and his, and both were closing in. He reached for his bow, his movements calm, deliberate. "Stay behind me," he said softly. She wanted to argue, but her voice caught in her throat. All she could do was watch as he stepped forward, the rising sun glinting off the wet strands of his hair, his shoulders squared as though facing destiny itself. The riders shouted again, their voices carried on the wind. She could see them now, their rifles raised, their faces hard with hate. The traitor among them, the scarred man at the front. The Apache Chief drew his weapon, his eyes locked on the men below. The air between them seemed to thrum with tension, every heartbeat stretching the silence to its breaking point. And just as the first rifle fired, the world exploded in sound, light, and chaos, marking the beginning of a storm no heart could walk away from unchanged. The first shot tore through the dawn air, echoing across the ridge like a warning from heaven itself. The settlers' rifles flared in bursts of light, their shouts tangled with thunder as smoke filled the rising sun. The Apache Chief stood his ground, arrows flashing from his bow with deadly precision, striking the earth near their feet to hold them back without spilling blood. He could have killed, but he didn't. He wanted them to understand something deeper than hate. She crouched behind the rocks, her heart hammering. The smell of gunpowder stung her nose, and every shot made her flinch. When she saw him step forward, into the open, exposed against the gray morning, she felt her breath catch. "No," she whispered, voice trembling. "Don't do this." But he didn't turn back. The scarred settler leading the group yelled, "There he is, the chief, take him down." Before they could fire again, she leapt out from behind the boulder and ran between them, her arms raised. "Stop!" she cried, her voice breaking through the gunfire. "Stop shooting!" The men froze in disbelief. Mud clung to her skirt, rain streaked her face, but she didn't care. She planted herself in front of him, a small figure between two worlds on the edge of ruin. "He didn't attack you," she shouted. "You're the ones chasing ghosts. There's been no raid. You're killing an innocent man." The scarred man's eyes narrowed. "Step aside, girl. That savage has tricked you." "He saved my life," she yelled, pointing back toward the canyon. "If it weren't for him, I'd be dead out there. He's no savage. He's a man, and he deserves to live." The men hesitated, uneasy. Some lowered their rifles slightly, glancing at one another. The chief stood silent behind her, his presence calm, even as his fate hung in the balance. The scarred leader sneered. "You'd risk your life for him? For one of them?" Her voice wavered but didn't break. "I'd risk it for the truth." The storm clouds parted just enough for the sun to break through, painting the canyon in gold. The light hit his face then, strong, steady, unyielding. It made him look like part of the land itself, carved from it, bound to it. The moment hung between them all, tense and still. Then a single shot rang out, not from the settlers, but from the ridge above. A bullet struck the ground inches from the leader's boots. Everyone looked up to see more Apache riders silhouetted against the sky, their bows drawn, their horses restless and ready. The scarred man cursed, stepping back. "We're surrounded." The chief didn't move. He raised his hand, signaling the riders to hold. The gesture carried authority, peace and warning all at once. "No blood today," he said in a voice that carried over the wind. "No more death." The settlers looked uncertain now, caught between fear and shame. The younger among them began to lower their guns. The scarred man, however, still gripped his rifle, fury burning in his eyes. "You think I'll just walk away?" he spat. The chief stepped forward, unarmed, until they stood only a few paces apart. "You fight because you fear what you do not understand. You hate what you cannot own." The settler's jaw tightened, his finger twitched on the trigger. Then, before he could fire, lightning cracked once more, blinding them both. The rifle went off, but the bullet struck a rock and ricocheted harmlessly into the canyon. The blast knocked the man backward, and his rifle clattered from his hands. The silence that followed was heavy. The rain had stopped. The world seemed to be waiting. Slowly, the scarred man got to his knees, staring at the ground, his anger spent. He looked up, and for the first time, there was no hatred left in his eyes, only weariness. "Maybe you're right," he muttered. Then he turned to his men. "We're done here." One by one they mounted their horses and rode off, leaving, behind only the sound of dripping water and the soft sigh of wind through the canyon. She turned to the chief, tears shining in her eyes. "It's over," she whispered. "You don't have to run anymore." He looked at her, his gaze deep with both gratitude and sorrow. "It is not over. Not for them. Not for us." She knew he was right. Peace was never so simple. The land still carried old wounds, and trust would not grow overnight. But in that moment, something had changed. Two worlds had met and chosen mercy over madness, and that was a start. He reached out, brushing a strand of wet hair from her face. "You could go back," he said softly. "Your people will still take you." Her voice trembled. "After what I've done? After standing against them?" He didn't answer. She looked down, the weight of her choice pressing on her chest. Then, after a long moment, she lifted her eyes again. "I don't want to go back. Not there. Not anymore." He studied her face, searching for doubt. Finding none, he nodded slowly. "Then come," She followed him through the narrow trail that led down into the canyon. The other Apache riders watched in silence as they passed. No one spoke, but their eyes followed her with cautious curiosity. Some faces showed distrust, others quiet respect. By the time they reached the camp, the storm had passed, leaving the air cool and clean. Fires were being rekindled, smoke rising into the pale sky. Children peeked from behind tents and elders stood watching. She felt their stares but kept walking beside him. The chief led her to the riverbank where the water ran clear and cold. He stopped and turned toward her. "This place has always been a border," he said. "Your people on one side, mine on the other. Maybe it's time that ends." She looked at the river, then at him. "Then let it end with us." He gave a small nod, and for the first time, his stern expression softened into something warm and human. "If you stay, it will not be easy. You will be between two worlds." She smiled faintly. "Maybe that's where I've belonged all along." For a while they stood in silence, the wind moving gently through the reeds. The sound of distant drums rose from the camp, steady and strong, a heartbeat of the earth itself. It felt like the world was breathing again after a long-held breath. Over the next days, the settlers did not return. Word spread quietly that the fighting was done, that the chief had spared them when he could have taken revenge. Some called it mercy, others called it weakness, but those who had seen it knew it was something else: honor. At the trading post, the old woman told anyone who would listen how the young woman had stood in front of rifles to save a man the world said she should hate. Some believed her, others didn't. But the story grew, like all stories that matter, carried by wind and memory. Back in the canyon, life returned to a rhythm shaped by healing. She helped where she could, learning their ways, their songs, their silence. Sometimes she would catch him watching her from across the fire, that same unreadable look in his eyes, part wonder, part disbelief that she had stayed. One evening, as the sun fell behind the mesas, painting everything in shades of red and gold, he came to her side. The light caught the faint scar on his shoulder, a mark from a battle long ago. She reached out, tracing it gently. "Does it hurt?" she asked. "Only when I remember," he said. Then his hand covered hers. "You are not what I expected." She smiled softly. "Neither are you." The quiet between them was easy now, no longer heavy with fear or doubt. The world had shifted, just enough to let something new take root. As the stars began to appear, he looked toward the horizon where the land stretched wide and unbroken. "The wind will carry your name far," he said. "Maybe one day they will tell it differently, that the rancher's daughter turned from her world, and the Apache chief let her stay." She leaned her head against his shoulder, listening to the steady rhythm of his breath. "Then let them tell it true," she whispered. "That we both chose what was right, even when the world said it was wrong." The fire crackled softly beside them, sending sparks into the darkening sky. The wind shifted again, carrying the scent of rain and earth, of peace hard-earned. And somewhere between two worlds that had never learned to live together, they did, quietly, stubbornly, and without regret. The ridge that once echoed with gunfire now held only the whispers of the wind and the faint echo of a promise kept. The war between them had ended, not with victory or defeat, but with understanding, and in that they found something neither of them had dared hope for: freedom not of land or power, but of the heart.